représentante spéciale du Canada chargée de la lutte contre l'islamophobie. Bonjour, je m'appelle Amira Elghawaby. Je suis la représentante spéciale chargée de la lutte contre l'islamophobie. I grew up here in Ottawa, and I had a very privileged youth where even as the daughter of immigrants from Egypt, I was always really encouraged in school to share all of the diverse identities that I had. So as the daughter of Egyptian parents, with a Muslim faith, these identities were always very positively viewed. And so I always had such a real hope for growing up in Canada as being a place that I could be fully authentic. And it was actually a decision I made in university to start wearing the hijab. And my father was the one who had said to me, "Oh, be careful, you might face discrimination." And I was like, no, this is Canada. If I can't, be authentic to who I am and my identities, where in the world can I do it? That was before 9/11, and I hadn't even heard of the word Islamophobia. And so, given all that positive experiences in schools where, principals and teachers were like, share who you are with us. It was so positive. All of a sudden, everything flipped upside down after 9/11. And that was such a wake-up call to all of the various forms of discrimination that people can face here in Canada. And that's where I started to learn more and more about how our communities could be vilified and othered. And it was really difficult. I was in journalism, and over the years I got into advocacy and realized that this promise of a country where, of course, there's a lot to learn about reconciliation and Indigenous communities, but we're trying to fix things, and yet we still see hate, we still see division. So my life's work became about preserving that dream and that hope that I had growing up in this country, and really thinking about how I was going to contribute to helping save these values of inclusion and equity that I saw under threat. So when this role came up, it really spoke to me. It spoke to me because it was addressing a really serious situation. On a vu l'islamophobie était plus en plus quelque chose dans nos vies que beaucoup des musulmans canadiens sentaient. And we had seen the massacre in Quebec City on 29th of January. We saw the attack against a family walking in the street in London, Ontario. This was not the country that I remember from my youth. My kids had been starting to get exposed to all of this, asking me at one point, looking at the newspaper the day after what happened in London, Mama, why are people wanting to kill Muslims? That's not a question that any parent wants to answer or has to answer, or should be answering. And so taking on this role was feeling that I was stepping up to use the skills, the expertise, the work I'd done in human rights and journalism to help support our communities and Canadians generally, and really supporting our right to exist here fully, authentically, and to have our human rights respected. And this is for everyone who lives in Canada. So this role is really like an advisor to the federal government. Basically, it is listening to communities, what I've been doing, throughout my professional career. It's about hearing, what are the struggles, what are the challenges people are facing, how is Islamophobia impacting their lives. It was after the attack in London, Ontario, where there was an Islamophobia summit that was called by the federal government. The same week there was one on anti-Semitism as well, because we can't ignore any forms of hate. And so in that summit, we heard from communities that said, here's a bunch of recommendations for all levels of government, including the establishment of this office. And so really it was there to make sure that there was a direct channel of communication between Canadian Muslims and federal ministers, the Prime Minister, on advising on the ways that policies have been impacting people's day-to-day lives, really making sure that I'm supporting federal departments in addressing systemic forms of Islamophobia, sort of, the legacy of post 9/11, where we saw various public safety policies and legislation that were harmful to our communities, where Canadian Muslims had seen their civil liberties eroded, and by extension the civil liberties of other Canadians as well. So really it's that type of role. It's also about raising awareness, doing interviews like this one, talking about impacts, thinking about the federal initiatives that are underway on anti-racism, on combating hate, and letting Canadians know that they have a role to play in all of this. And finally, really, it's about providing resources. So working on, a guide on Islamophobia that we hope to be sharing with Canadians soon, highlighting resources like guides on addressing hate crimes in our community. So it's really multifaceted, and it really has been a very busy 2 years. Yeah, so my experience with Islamophobia is, of course, I've had over the years, as recently as this past weekend, have faced harassment, have faced Islamophobic discourse, have been told, really, really offensive things, things that I wouldn't repeat because I don't want to sort of relive it myself, and I also don't want to harm others who are listening. Because if we dwell too much on what those who want to spread hate do, then again we may lose hope in how we fully function and participate. So I've experienced harassment. I've experienced, years ago, a truck almost deliberately hit me. When I was just had my first child, and I was out for a walk in my neighborhood here in Ottawa. I never reported it to police, like many victims of hate crimes don't report to police. It never occurred to me. I was just scared and went home and ran home. And so I have had those experiences. But at the same time, it's very important for me to say, for every one negative experience over my course of wearing the hijab, I've had many very positive experiences as well. And I think that's the only way I keep going, is thinking about all the kind people. So recently, when I had some harassment, very, very recently, several people who witnessed came up to me and they said, "That's not right. We stand with you. What do you need? How can we help you?" And so, yes, I faced Islamophobia on a personal level, but I've also had great allyship as well, incredible allyship. That's what I hold with me, and I hope that those who are watching who've experienced any form of hate, that they don't let it change who they are, that they don't let it change what they do, that they stay strong, and that they know that, again, the vast majority of Canadians, I'm fully convinced, are caring and loving and will not stand for hate. When my appointment was announced, there was an incredible amount of hope expressed by Canadian Muslims from coast to coast to coast. I had done a lot of work in our communities as a human rights advocate, as a journalist. I have written extensively, and so our communities knew what I was all about and were very hopeful in this role. That there would be criticism, that there would be discussions about things that I had written, that was unanticipated. But certainly, I did what I think anyone should do in that position, is to listen, to hear the concerns that people are raising, and to demonstrate in action that we can actually have a dialogue, and where there are misunderstandings, where words can hurt how people are feeling, acknowledge that and take responsibility for that, which is what I did. and then move on to the really important work that I think Quebecers, that I think Ontarians, Albertans, Manitobans, those Atlantic Canadians, this country is vast. And in every province, I think Saskatchewan's in there, all of these beautiful provinces make up a beautiful country. And we have a lot of work to do to preserve the values of inclusion, multiculturalism, diversity. And that's where we have to roll up our sleeves. And that's what I did. I went, very soon after the appointment to London, Ontario. I came to Quebec. I've been meeting regularly with Quebec Muslims, with others across the country to hear about their concerns. And there really hasn't been a moment that I've really had much time to rest because the work is vast. Well, I want to really applaud members of our communities, organizations like those organizing the Muslim Awareness Week in Quebec, various organizations, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Canadian Muslim Forum, Sisters Dialogue, all these different organizations in Quebec and outside of Quebec who, are not running away from this discussion, even though there are some days where we read what's being said about our communities in social media or in the newspapers or on TV or radio, and we're like, who are they talking about? That's not who we are. We're Canadians just like anybody else. Like, we get up in the morning, we get our kids ready for school if we have kids, or we get ourselves ready for school or work, and we head out wanting to do the very best, not just for ourselves, not just for our family, but for Canada, but for the world. And so this vilification of our communities that continues really, really makes all of us feel at times that, should we just throw in the towel and give up? And yet many organizations led by wonderful, Canadian Muslim men and women, youth, all sorts of people who just want to say, you know what, we're not going to give up. Why? Because there are a lot of Canadians out there, there are a lot of Quebecers out there who just need to get to know us, just need to figure out, what's actually true in what we're reading, and what's actually kind of sensationalizing things, maybe to sell papers, maybe to get, clicks, maybe to get ratings, and just kind of break through that noise, and really understand that, there are two paths that we can choose here. We can choose to go down a path of polarization, of division, of, being suspicious of one another, trying to put up laws that prevent each other from exercising our rights and freedoms. Sure, we can go down that path. But I think, and I have a lot of confidence, that the majority of people, because we're all people, majority of people just want to live peacefully. They just want everybody to be treated fairly. And they want their kids to grow up in a society where they're just free to be who they are and just do the very best they can. So as long as I have that hope, and the leaders who are doing all of the important work that they're doing in their communities, like Muslim Awareness Week, like various Open Doors initiatives, like interfaith dialogues that happen across this country, we're going to keep doing that so long as that hope exists. La lutte contre l'islamophobie, c'est un problème qui existe comme toute forme de racisme qui existe, de sexisme qui existe. On aimerait bien que ça n'existe plus, que tout notre travail, on pourrait dire, on a éliminé. But the sad reality is we have not eliminated forms of hate, division, racism, Islamophobia, sexism, homophobia, all of these forms of discrimination. They exist. And if I talk about the evolution of the past few years, if we think back to January 29th and the night that we learned that 6 Quebec Muslims were killed in cold blood, all they had done was go to the place of worship, a place of sanctity, to be together, to pray. Where are we from there? The sad truth is that online spaces have really, really done a number on our sense of unity, social cohesion. We see online hate rapidly spreading. We've had at least over 400% increases in anti-Muslim narratives online, in different periods throughout the past year, for example, year and a half. And so what we are seeing is that this acceleration of discourse that's about division, that's not wanting to talk about equity and diversity and inclusion, that's wanting to silence these conversations. And so on that one hand, it's not looking great. But on the other hand, the hope that we continue to hold is that people are gonna continue to push back against this, and the way that we push back is through those relationships that we build with each other in our own local communities. So, for example, right here in Ottawa, I've made really deep friendships with rabbis, with members of the church, people who don't have any practice at all, who are humanist, who are atheist. We build relationships on common values of caring, of just simply wanting to make our society better. That's what's going to count more than ever. Those personal relationships we build with each other, the hello that we say at the grocery store or in the elevator, just creating a space that is respectful, that respects people's dignity, we're really going to have to lean into those muscles. C'était vraiment important d'avoir une journée de commémoration de l'attentat sur la mosquée de Québec et de lutter contre l'islamophobie. C'était vraiment, vraiment important. Et la raison c'est important, c'est parce qu'on ne veut pas oublier ce qui se passait cette nuit-là. Cette nuit-là représentait le danger qui pose l'islamophobie à le bien-être, la cohésion sociale de notre pays. It was so important that advocates working to tell and advise the federal government that we needed this national commemoration, because just as we saw, for instance, gendered attacks on women at the Polytechnique on December 6th in Montreal, and having that national day to commemorate that horrible tragedy, which has become a day of learning, of education about the dangers of femicide, the dangers of misogyny in our society. Similarly, now, January 29th has become a day to learn about the dangers of Islamophobia. I met with the families of the victims of the Quebec City massacre just this past weekend. I can tell you that what the widows told me was how valuable it was to them to see this work continue, how much it meant to them and to their kids, that there was this national recognition of what had happened, that they saw that Canadians really cared about this, and that they wanted us, those of us who are working in these spaces, to continue to talk about it. It hurts, of course. There were many tears in those conversations. It's difficult. One of the children I met, it took a long while for me even to be able to start speaking to him, because I could see he's only 11 and his father was killed 8 years ago. He was just 3 years old, and I could see how closed he was and uncertain in that space. But as we started to talk, he started to open up, and I think we need to think about those children. We need to think about all kids. What kind of Canada are we building here? And these national days, they're about remembering and learning from the history. What did we learn from January 29th? We learned that negative discourse, online hate, can fuel division in our society. What elected leaders say matters. The perpetrator of January 29th had actually been consuming various online platforms where hatred towards various minorities, including Muslims, were prominent. He acted out after the Prime Minister of Canada put out a tweet in response to President Donald Trump's so-called Muslim ban, where the Prime Minister of Canada said Canada is a place where everyone is welcome. That was the last straw for the perpetrator and the murderer and the terrorist in this attack. That's what made him feel he had to go out and commit these horrendous acts of terror. And it was all building on this rhetoric that Muslims are a danger. He wanted to, quote unquote, protect his family from all that he'd heard unfairly about Muslims. And he was not able to distinguish the truth. He did not have, I guess, the opportunity to actually meet Quebec Muslims. And that's the worst manifestation of Islamophobia. But we don't want to wait for the next massacre to think about this all over again. That's why these days matter, so that we keep remembering and we keep calling out those who are clearly on a path of division, and we try to bring them in and say a better Canada is possible. So I've been working on Islamophobia since at least 2012, in a variety of different spaces, and I can at least say and share with you, we have made progress in even be able to talk about the term Islamophobia. For a while there was a lot of contestation about the term itself, and we were like, hey, we're experiencing all of this hate, we're experiencing all this discrimination, this is Islamophobia. People have an irrational fear about who we are. They're spreading all this misinformation, and some within the public space would kind of stop us right there and say, oh, are you saying that we can't criticize Islam? That's going to harm our freedom of expression. And we're like, no, sure, criticize Islam, criticize anything that you like, but don't vilify Canadian Muslims, Quebec Muslims, any Muslims at all. Don't vilify an entire global community, a national community here in Canada, now over 4% of the population. Don't vilify us. That's Islamophobia. And it took a long time for Canadians and those in positions of authority to get it. It took the killing of 11 Canadian Muslims for people to get it. And that's wrong. It shouldn't have taken that long. We should have had much more help and much more support even before all of this happened. And yet it took all of that. It took the loss of our London family, the loss of Quebec Muslims at the Quebec City Mosque. It took a stabbing death of a volunteer caretaker in Toronto in 2020 who was stabbed to death as well. It took all of those tragic losses for, sadly, many people to wake up and say, you know what, this is really serious. And so, I think now we see school boards, for instance, adopting anti-Islamophobia strategies. We see universities talking about policies to ensure that all students and faculty, including those who practice Islam or Muslim, are able to be in spaces that are discrimination-free. But it is an ongoing work in progress, and I think that's really the key message here, is that there's always more work to do to advance these important values. So over the past year and a half, since October 7th, what we have really seen is a significant rise of anti-Palestinian racism, of Islamophobia, of anti-Arab racism, alongside anti-Semitism, and we condemn all of that. None of that is okay. And I think that it's really tested our communities in different ways. We've seen that Canadian Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, and allies have seen their civil liberties really tested over the past year and a half. And one of the very first statements that I put out from my office was that Canadian Muslims were not going to allow themselves to go back to a time post 9/11 where we have to apologize and explain things that have nothing to do with us. We have every right to have our freedom of expression respected, freedom of assembly respected. These are charter rights and freedoms. Of course, any form of hate must be condemned. Consequences to anyone spreading, inciting hate, that's a non-negotiable, that's critical. But at the same time, our communities really have seen an effort to associate our concerns and concerns that are being raised about what's happening to Palestinians, of which many Canadian Muslims, Canadian Palestinians have loved ones in Gaza, being associated with terrorism simply for speaking up, simply for posting, simply for talking about it. I've heard cases where, a public servant who was from Gaza, had very difficult times just thinking about and returning to what she had endured after seeing what was happening to her loved ones, and right here in Ottawa, facing some repercussions at work simply for expressing how it was affecting her emotionally. And so that's not okay. And I think that that's really the main message I would say, is that it has tested our sense of belonging, including for young people. And it's really an important opportunity to really recommit to our shared values of social cohesion, inclusion, respect, but also our civil liberties and the right to freely express ourselves on issues that are impacting on us, our loved ones, anywhere in the world. And so this really has been a very, very challenging time for many communities. I know that Canadian Palestinians who are Muslim but also Christian and other faiths are going to experience anti-Palestinian racism that is connected and can be connected to Islamophobia, but is also distinct. And so it has been really important for my office to ensure that we help educate Canadians about this distinct form of discrimination, just as we see intersecting identities where people can be impacted by discrimination, racism for a variety of identities. It's really important to understand that Canadian Palestinians will face a distinct form of discrimination as well. And I was very much hopeful to hear directly from the Prime Minister his commitment to defining and recognizing anti-Palestinian racism at the federal level. And this is really important, something that we're working on, because over the past year and a half, there has been efforts to almost silence those who are talking about anti-Palestinian racism. There's a case for example, in one school here in Ottawa where a young elementary school child was online, put a little profile pic of the Palestinian flag, and the school principal berated this child online in front of other classmates, saying that he was making other students feel unsafe. The student then said, well, you're making me feel unsafe. And in the end, the principal had to apologize, because being Palestinian is their identity. And they have Palestinian Canadians, and Palestinians have the right to that identity. And I think that understanding that type of discrimination is really important, particularly in a climate like this one. So I know that it's been a very, very difficult times for Canadian Muslims, Arabs, Palestinians, for Canadian Jewish communities as well. I have dear friends within the Canadian Jewish community. For instance, recently I met with a local rabbi, Elizabeth Bolton, who we sat together and we actually just sat and cried. We just cried because, the discourse about our communities has been so negative and so divisive. And at the core, our faiths teach love and compassion and respect. And we demonstrate that in our actions, in our relationship, and we know that it's been a very difficult time. We're hoping the ceasefire holds, and that as peace slowly returns, again, there is no peace without justice. So that's going to be an important part of this discourse. It's not just ending the war, but ensuring that international humanitarian law is respected and upheld. And so how do you have interfaith dialogues with communities if we can't first establish that respect for human rights of each other? So being able to have interfaith dialogue has been difficult because it has to start from a shared respect for human rights. And that's been a challenging conversation where things are so emotional. Another example, locally, there's a local Rabbi Blom, and an educator from the Muslim community named Aisha Shirazi. They've been going all around schools in Ottawa for a long time, even before October 7th, talking about shared values, talking about stereotypes, talking about how we fight anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. I was really, really pleased to be able to join them for one of those presentations, to take part in it, to talk to kids about these very critical things. And so you'll find folks, I call them the peacemakers. You will find the peacemakers who are interested in dialogue, in demonstrating that solidarity. And then there will be those that are not interested. And so not only are they not interested, there will be those that are actually spreading even further division. That's the challenge we're in. But I hope that people, really decide to be peacemakers. What I have heard loud and clear from my visits in Quebec with Quebec Muslims, and in particular with Quebec Muslim women, is that Law 21 has had a very detrimental impact on their sense of belonging, on their sense of safety in the province. And this is played out in various surveys and research that have been done. And so, we've also seen a lower court in Quebec judge say that there are disproportionate impacts on Quebec Muslim women, and in fact, he described the law as cruel. So not only for Quebec Muslim women, but other religious minorities in the province, Sikh communities, Jewish communities who have talked about the impacts on them, it has been difficult. And so what I've heard since the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada to listen and hear the case, in which the federal government will be intervening as well, is that there is hope. There is hope out there that our rights and freedoms as Canadians are not easily undermined, devalued, taken away from us. And I think this is really important for Canadians. No one should be treated differently for their identities. Everyone should have the same access to the same rights and freedoms. When I get up in the morning, I should be able to wear what I want. I should be able to participate fully in the society. I should not have to tell a little girl or a little boy who wants to be a teacher or a police officer that profession may be closed to them because of how they decide to practice their faith when they grow up. That's not the kind of Canada we want. That's not what the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is about. And I think that we hope that more and more people will understand that this is really about living in a democracy where pluralism, where vivre ensemble actually mean that we respect each other and we help each other to contribute in every way that we want to in the most positive way.
Et qu'est-ce que vous dites au gouvernement québécois qui, lui, explique que c'est la compétence de la province?
So my role in talking about Law 21 is providing the advice to the federal government. And my advice and my experience now meeting with Quebec Muslims has been that this law does impact on their rights and freedoms, and the federal government has committed to intervening in this case because it is a question of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms of all Canadians. This is a national issue, and so this is where we will wait to see how the Supreme Court of Canada rules on this really critical question that impacts not even just religious minorities, it impacts all Canadians, because it's this case that will really give us better understanding of how safe are the rights and freedoms that we are guaranteed in the Charter. Yeah, so my role as a special representative to combat Islamophobia is to make recommendations to the federal government on policies that are impacting on Canadian Muslims. And as well, I listen to what communities are going through, and so at times there are issues that are happening at different levels of government in different parts of our communities. What I was hearing was the rise of Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, anti-Arab racism on university campuses, and of course I wasn't the only one hearing about this. In fact, a university in Ontario brought in a retired judge to do take a focused look at some issues that had occurred at the Toronto Metropolitan University. And he produced a report based on his study of what had gone wrong. There had been questions around anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. So he produced a really important report. His name's retired Justice MacDonald. So in his recommendations, he had many. They included ensuring better representation within the law faculty. And so he looked at that law faculty, he found that there was no Muslim, Arab, or Palestinian professors, and he said within the structure of the university, within their policies, to think about increasing that representation. So in my letter, I referenced that report, I referenced Judge MacDonald, and it was quite a well-received letter right across Canada. I've heard from university presidents, college presidents welcoming my recommendations. And in fact, university teacher associations in Quebec said these recommendations about increasing representation, increasing diversity are normal. They're actually normal policies. And they're, of course, always merit-based. I think what's sad about the discourse is the assumption that we're talking about just hiring any Quebec Muslim, any Quebec Palestinian off the street just because of their identity. Obviously not. And that's really important. It's all about, of course, merit, but just as we ensure that there's a good representation of women in different spaces, different racialized people, it's within that same vein. So that's really what that was all about. But again, in a democracy, we can talk about these things. They were recommendations, as the Prime Minister said, and people can take or leave them. And that's what living in a place where we can talk about ideas and take them up or not, that's what's so great about living in a place like Canada. I think I would say that as the rise of polarization happens around the world, where there are more and more online spaces where division is really part of the discourse, we know that sometimes algorithms have been found to amplify posts and content that make people angry. This is very distressing. The federal government recently put out a report this past summer that said the number one biggest threat to Canadians is the inability to distinguish between what is true and what is not true. And so all of these various trends are very concerning for anyone who cares about social cohesion, who cares about bringing people together, who cares about the truth. I, just like anyone watching these trends, are deeply worried, and very hopeful that nevertheless, again, we're going to lean into those relationships, we're going to build and nurture those relationships, and we're going to hope for the best. So my role is an independent advisor to the federal government. I'm nonpartisan. My role is really about, again, providing that advice, and I will continue to do this work. My mandate is 4 years, and I will keep doing the work. And whatever happens at the governmental level, we take it day by day, and I'm here to fulfill a very important mission.